The Apache warrior closed his eyes to die, but instead woke up in a farmer's bed. Wild West story. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The frost didn't melt by noon. It hadn't melted in weeks. The ridge where Jonas Reddick lived sat about 2 miles above the old rail line that had stopped running the year the mines collapsed. The land there was hard, sloped, mostly dry, except where frost stuck to the low grass like thin ash. Juniper and rock bordered the edge of the canyon, and the cabin he'd built by hand faced east, catching whatever weak light the mornings offered. He kept to himself. By design, Jonas was 39, tall, broad at the shoulders, hands thick from labor. His hair had turned darker over the years, more from soot and weather than age, though the gray had started to show at the sides. A limp in his left leg made everything slower, especially on cold days like this. He didn't complain. There was no one to hear it anyway. His wife and son had died 5 winters ago. Fever, quick and brutal. Nothing he could have done. He'd buried them behind the barn. He didn't mark the graves with anything fancy, just 2 simple wooden crosses and a space he didn't step over. Since then, he lived quiet. Worked when the land allowed it. Fixed fences, grew beans and potatoes, kept the animals fed. He didn't go into town unless he had to, and even then, he avoided folks. They talked too much, asked questions he didn't care to answer. That morning, he was checking the southern fence. The last windstorm had pushed over a stretch of rail near the edge of the drop, and one of the corner posts had cracked at the base. He carried with him a new stake, his small axe, and a length of hemp rope. His breath came out white and sharp in the still air. Each step through the frost crunched loud enough that it echoed off the rocks nearby. The sun was up, but it didn't offer warmth. Just light that he was focused on digging out the damaged post when something off to the left caught his eye. It wasn't movement, just a shape out of place, low in the brush, covered in frost and dust. Jonas stood still and narrowed his eyes at a first glance. It looked like a discarded tarp or maybe an old saddle blanket. But the longer he stared, the more he noticed edges that didn't line up like cloth, a curve that looked too much like a shoulder. And then he saw a hand, not moving, half buried under brush and dirt, fingers crusted in blood, clutching a bone-handled knife. His whole body still, he didn't run forward. He'd seen too much in the war, and too much after it, to assume anything was ever over just because it looked still. Instead, he stepped slowly toward it, one boot at a time, until he was crouched close enough to see her face. It was a woman. Apache, by the look of her. Young, maybe mid-20s. Her face was narrow, high-boned, eyes closed but sunken from starvation or illness. Her long black hair was braided in places, loose in others, caked in dirt and matted with dried blood. Her skin, where it wasn't bruised or frozen, had a deep, rich tone that was dulled now by dust and exposure. Her dress was torn, shoulder ripped wide open, fabric hanging down across her chest. He could see the outline of her ribs, sharp under her skin. There were cuts on her arms, dark marks along her collarbone. Some older, some fresh. Jonas crouched, leaned in, and studied her breathing. Shallow, faint, but still there. Her chest rose in uneven rhythm, a ragged pulse in her throat barely visible under the grime. He exhaled quietly, his jaw tightening. He had a decision to make. There was no one watching. No one who'd know if he turned around and left her there. No one who'd even blame him. This wasn't a safe place for a white man to be found helping an Apache woman. Not in these parts. Townsfolk would talk. Some might accuse him of worse. And he knew well enough the risk of taking in someone he didn't know, someone wounded, possibly hunted, but something in the way she still gripped the knife, even now, even unconscious, made him hesitate. She hadn't given up. Not yet. He reached forward slowly, wrapped his fingers around the knife handle. Her hand was stiff but not locked. He pried it loose, then laid it aside on the ground. He didn't throw it, just kept it where he could reach it if he needed to. Then he lifted her. Her body was limp in his arms, cold, lighter than it should have been, her skin too soft from exposure and her legs trailing against the brush. She didn't stir. Her head lolled against his shoulder. The walk back to the cabin took longer than usual. His leg ached bad by the halfway point. He stopped only once to shift her weight and catch his breath, then pushed forward. When he reached the cabin, the sky had started to dim, evening coming in faster than it should have. He kicked the door open gently, eased her inside, and laid her down on the bed, his bed. She didn't make a sound, didn't open her eyes, just lay there, arm bent loosely across her chest, skin still streaked with dried blood and mud that he moved quick after that. Tossed more logs on the fire, pulled water from the bucket beside the stove, and set it to boil. Grabbed his tin of cloth scraps and old whiskey bottle he kept for cleaning wounds. He worked in silence. There was no panic, just movement, just routine. As he cleaned the dirt from her arms and face, he noticed more bruising. Some defensive, others not. Some fresh, others deep yellow, already healing. He didn't ask what had happened. She wasn't in any shape to answer. He stitched the deepest gash along her ribs. Clumsy work, but enough to hold. Poured whiskey on the wound and wrapped it in torn linen. She flinched once, but didn't wake. That he placed the bone-handled knife on the chair beside the bed, within reach. Then he sat down by the fire, back to the wall, and watched her chest rise and fall. His thoughts that night weren't loud. They rarely were anymore, but they were steady. What had happened to her? Who had done it? And what was she running from? But above all, was she going to live through the night? The woman woke before dawn. Jonas heard the shift before he saw it. Fabric rustling, the faint scrape of wood. He opened his eyes to find her upright in the bed, the quilt drawn halfway around her, her face pale but alert. She hadn't cried out. She hadn't asked where she was. She was looking at the chair beside her, at the knife he'd left there. Her eyes flicked to him next. They stared at each other for a long few seconds. Her hand was close to the knife, but not on it. Jonas didn't move. "You're in my cabin," he said finally, voice low and flat. "Found you by the canyon." She didn't respond. Her gaze dropped to the bandage wrapped around her ribs, then to her arm where the cuts had been cleaned and stitched. "You were bleeding," he added. "Did what I could." Still, no words from her. But she didn't reach for the knife. Jonas stood slowly, testing his bad leg, before putting full weight on it. He walked to the stove, poured hot water from the kettle into a tin cup, and set it on the table. Then he tore off a piece of the bread he'd baked the day before, stale now, but still good when softened, and placed it beside the cup. "You need to eat," he said. "Been 2 days." Her head tilted slightly. She was listening now. Try to measure him. He saw the questions in her eyes, the kind people never said aloud. "Why didn't you take advantage? Why didn't you tie me up? Why leave the knife?" He didn't answer those. He just moved to the far end of the cabin, picked up the axe he'd been working on sharpening, and sat at the bench by the window. Behind him, he heard the sound of the quilt shifting again. Then, tentatively, the clink of tin. She was drinking. The tension in his chest eased, just a little to be why full daylight. She'd finished half the bread and was leaning back against the wall. Her movements were slow, controlled, as if every inch of her body still ached, and it likely did. But she wasn't broken. That much was clear. There was strength under the bruises. Quiet, deliberate strength. Jonas knew that kind of survival. He'd carried it once, after the war, when every sound still made him reach for a rifle, and every morning started with a breath held too long. "I don't know your name," he said after a while. She said nothing. "Mine's Jonas Reddick." That didn't change anything. She kept her eyes on the window this time, watching the frost melt in the corners of the glass. He didn't push it. The next few hours passed in silence. Jonas tended the fire, chopped more kindling out back, and cleaned up the water basin. She didn't sleep, but she didn't speak either. Once, when he came back inside carrying the wood, he found her watching the door, shoulders stiff, hand near the knife again. He didn't react. "You can leave it," he said, nodding toward the knife. "I'm not going to take it from you." Her eyes narrowed. Then she looked away. By mid-afternoon, her breathing had steadied, and some of the color had returned to her face. She tried to get up. Jonas saw the shift in the bed, the way she moved her legs to the edge and braced her arms. He was beside her in 2 steps. "You shouldn't." She glared at him. "I'm just saying, you stand up now. You'll hit the floor." She ignored him. Her legs trembled the moment they took her weight. Jonas didn't grab her. He let her try. She made it 2 steps. Then her knees buckled and she started to fall. He caught her under the arms, gently, held her steady until she regained her footing. She didn't look up at him, just gritted her teeth and clutched the edge of the table. "I told you," he muttered. "You need more days." She hissed through her breath, not in pain, but anger. At herself, maybe at the weakness. At being in this place with a stranger. "I ain't keeping you here," he added. "Soon as you can walk, you're free to go." That got her attention. She looked at him sharply, eyes narrowed, like she was trying to figure out what kind of man says that and means it. He met her look with the same flat steadiness he always gave. No hidden intent, no threat. Then, finally, her voice came. "Rough. Tight, Tala." Jonas blinked. "What?" "My name," she said, voice quieter this time. "Tala." He nodded once. She pulled herself upright again and limped slowly back to the bed without asking for help. He watched her, made sure she didn't fall. When she sat, she pulled the quilt around herself again, breathing harder than before. Jonas let the silence hang a while longer. Later that night, she surprised him. She stood again, slow, unsteady, and reached for the broom he kept by the stove. Then she swept, one hand on her ribs, the other guiding the pine straw bristles across the dirt floor in slow, short strokes. He didn't ask why, he just watched by the time the fire burned down to embers. She'd return to the bed and tuck the knife. Not under her pillow, but beside it. Jonas sat back in a chair near the fire and stared into the coals. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew this much. She'd chosen to stay, for now, and that meant something. The cold didn't ease, but the days began to stretch a little longer. Morning light came earlier through the cabin window, and the air held less bite when Jonas stepped out to check the barn. The snow hadn't fallen in days, but hadn't melted either. The world was still white, still hard. But something had shifted inside the cabin. Tala was moving more on the third morning since she'd spoken her name. Jonas woke to the sound of water being poured. When he sat up, he saw her standing at the table, a wool blanket around her shoulders, ladling boiled water into the wash basin. She was slow but steady. Her braid was neater now, tighter. She'd done it herself. The bruises along her jaw had begun to fade from dark purple to yellow, and the cuts on her arms were closed. She didn't notice him watching her. She dipped a cloth in the hot water and wrung it out with one hand, then pressed it gently to her face, wiping away the grime that still lingered near her temples and cheekbones. It wasn't about cleanliness, it was control. Reclaiming something, Jonas swung his legs over the cot and stood, joints popping. His knee throbbed already. Weather made it worse. He moved toward the stove and poured coffee into a tin mug, then wordlessly poured a second and set on the table near her. She didn't thank him, but she sat, drank it. That morning, they worked in quiet rhythm. He went to repair the hinges on the chicken coop door. She remained inside, swept the floor again, sorted through the clean cloth strips he'd left from her bandages, folded them neat. When he came back inside, her eyes flicked up just once to confirm it was him. Then back to what she was doing, in no panic. No tension. Trust? Not quite, but tolerance. Jonas didn't ask any questions that day. He figured she'd speak when she was ready. But there were things about her he couldn't stop thinking about. Things unsaid. She hadn't asked where she was, or how far she'd come, or if someone was looking for her. She hadn't explained the bruises, or the deep gash along her ribs, or the old scar on the side of her neck. He had a sense that something brutal had driven her here. But whatever it was, she wasn't ready to talk about it. Late that afternoon, while Jonas was mending a loose board along the barn wall, he turned to find her standing just outside the cabin door, wrapped in the blanket, her bare feet sunk into the snow-packed earth. She was watching him, watching the barn, watching everything. He wiped his hands on his coat and walked toward her. "You don't got boots," he said. She didn't answer. Her gaze shifted to the corral beyond the barn. Then, finally, "This your land?" He nodded. 20 acres. Give or take." "Yours?" she repeated, like she didn't believe it. "My wife's pa gave it to us when we married. She died. I stayed." A pause. "Your wife?" He didn't flinch. Fever took her. "And our boy." She stared at him, and for the first time, he saw something shift in her expression. Not pity, just understanding. like she knew that kind of loss that he waited. You got people. Her eyes dropped. Not anymore. He didn't press. They stood like that for a minute, the silence drawing long between them. Not uncomfortable, just cold. Then he stepped inside and came back with a bundle, an old pair of wool socks, worn leather moccasins his wife used to wear when tending the goats. He offered them without a word. She didn't reach out right away, but she took them. The next morning, she started cooking. Jonas returned from cutting kindling to the smell of corn mush boiling over the fire. He blinked, set down the axe, and watched her. She moved carefully, favoring her side, but with a kind of quiet focus. There was still bruising across her chest. He saw it when her shawl slipped, but she didn't hide it anymore. She stirred the pot with a carved spoon and ladled it into 2 bowls without asking. They ate in silence, but the air between them was warmer than it had been. Later that day, as he sanded a warped board near the porch, she came to him holding the knife. Not as a threat. She held out to him, handle first. You left this for me, she said. But I don't need to keep it close anymore. Jonas didn't move. It's yours. I know. He didn't take it. You sure? She looked at him steadily. If you meant to harm me, you would have done it already. He gave the smallest nod. She placed the knife on the porch rail beside him and walked back inside. That night, she helped him hang a new oil lantern near the cot where he now slept. She stood on a chair while he steadied it. Her arm brushed his shoulder once, and she didn't pull away. Later, by the fire, she sat across from him, knees drawn to her chest under the blanket. You didn't ask what happened to me, she said suddenly. He looked up. The fire cast shadows across her face. You'd tell me if you wanted to, he answered. She nodded. Maybe soon. He didn't push, but he watched her face as she looked into the flames. How the light traced the healing marks across her cheek. How her jaw tightened when the fire popped too loud. How her eyes blinked hard every time the wind outside rattled the shutters. Whatever had happened, it wasn't over inside her yet, but she was still here, and she was beginning to stay on her own terms. The days blurred, but not from boredom. They were full in a quiet way. Mornings spent splitting wood or boiling beans. Afternoons mending things that didn't seem worth fixing until now. The cabin had never seen this kind of rhythm before. Not since Jonas buried his family. And Tala, though she still didn't talk much, had made herself part of that rhythm without asking. She no longer slept all day. Her wounds were healing. She could move freely now, though he noticed the way she still touched her side sometimes when the wind picked up or when she lifted anything too fast. The color had returned to her face. She wasn't pale anymore, and the way she carried herself, even when quiet, even when still, it was different now. Less like a woman waiting to die, and more like someone who had decided to keep living. That it was 3 days after she gave back the knife that she finally spoke of where she came from. They were sitting by the stove after supper. The fire had burned down low. Jonas was carving a new handle for his hand spade, the old one cracked from frost. Tala was seated near the window, sewing a torn sleeve on one of his old shirts. She'd asked for the needle herself the day before. I was with a band north of the Verde, she said quietly. 3 women, 1 boy. We were camped off the dry creek bed, past the stone ridge. Jonas didn't look up, but he stopped carving. It was supposed to be safe. No soldiers, no white men. She didn't say more right away. The quiet returned, but it didn't feel finished. He waited. We weren't hiding, she added. We were just trying to wait out winter. Jonas nodded slowly. What happened? Her fingers paused over the cloth. Someone told them where we were. Who? I don't know. White trader, maybe. Or a scout. Doesn't matter. Jonas watched her. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't shake. But something in her had gone distant. I ran. Took the knife. Didn't have time to find the others. I don't know if they're alive. Jonas set the blade aside. You got this far on your own? He asked. She nodded once. I ran. Hid. Kept moving. I don't remember much after the river. Just pain. Cold. And then you woke up here. She looked around the cabin, as if seeing it properly for the first time. Yes. He thought about the wound on her ribs, the bruises across her back, the way her shoulders twitched when boots hit the floor too hard. Then he thought about how she stood straighter now, how she had asked to help cook, how she never once begged. You got anyone looking for you? He asked. She shook her head. Not anymore. He didn't ask if they were dead. He didn't need to. That night, she asked for a blanket to hang across the far end of the cabin, between the cot and the workbench. Not to hide, just to mark space. He gave it to her without a word and nailed 2 hooks to the beam so she could draw it when she wanted. She thanked him, the first time she'd said thank you out loud. The next morning, Jonas found her in the barn. He hadn't heard her leave the cabin. She was kneeling beside the old feed barrels, holding a broom, sweeping grain into a bucket with one hand while rubbing her knee with the other. Her moccasins were soaked with dew, her hair tied up in a knot behind her head. "You don't need to do that," he said from the doorway. "I know." She kept working. He stood there for a moment, hands at his sides. Then he stepped in and picked up the second broom. They worked side by side without speaking. By midday, the barn was cleaner than it had been in years. She helped him patch the door with leftover planks, her grip strong on the hammer despite her healing ribs. Once, while passing him a nail, her fingers brushed his. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. Later, back at the cabin, they sat on the porch for the first time together. The air was cold but still. A few crows moved across the tree line, slow and silent. Jonas rolled a cigarette with rough fingers and offered her one. She took it, studied it, then handed it back. "I don't smoke," she said. "But thanks." He lit his and leaned back, boots planted in the packed dirt. "Why'd you leave me the knife?" she asked after a while. "Because if I'd kept it, you'd never have stayed." She nodded slowly. "Most men wouldn't have done that." "I'm not most men." "I know." They sat like that until the sun dipped behind the ridge. Inside, she went to hang the stew pot over the fire. He stood behind her, close enough to feel the heat from her back. Her shirt had slipped slightly down her shoulder, revealing a long, pink scar that ran along her collar. She didn't cover it. He raised a hand, but didn't touch her. She turned just enough to see him. Then, without a word, she leaned in, forehead resting lightly against his chest, only for a second. Not clinging, not breaking down, just letting herself rest. Jonas didn't move. Not at first. Then he set his hand gently against her back, not to hold her, just to say he was there. That was enough for now. The thaw came slow but steady. Days stretched longer. Sunlight started cutting through the tree line earlier each morning, glinting off the melting snow in thin, silver lines that trickled down the slope behind the cabin. The wind had softened. Ice was retreating from the edge of the creek. You could hear water again. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, axe in hand, his coat unbuttoned for the first time in weeks. He chopped wood in measured rhythm, slow, even the kind of pace a man sets when his leg aches and he's got no one pushing him to rush. When he paused to catch his breath, he looked up and saw her, Tala, kneeling in the frost-bitten patch of ground beside the cabin, turning the soil with the small spade he'd loaned her. She wasn't asking anymore. She just worked. She had taken it upon herself to clear the ground where the snow had receded. Said she wanted to start early, plant something if spring came soon. She'd asked if he had any seeds. He gave her what he had left: beans, carrots, onions. The last of what his wife had once kept in a tin box beneath the stove. That he didn't stop her. He didn't help either. Just watched for a moment, then went back to chopping. There was something honest in the quiet between them now. Not cold silence, not distance, but ease. Familiar, like the rhythm of two people who'd started circling each other less out of caution and more out of habit. That evening, while she stirred beans in the pot, he spoke without looking up. "You think they'll come looking?" He didn't have to say who he meant. The ones who had chased her down from the dry creek. Whoever she had escaped from. Tala turned the spoon slowly through the bubbling stew, then set it down. "They didn't follow me this far," she said. "I made sure of that." Jonas met her eyes across the fire. "But if they do?" She didn't answer right away. "Then I won't run again." There was no bravado in it, just a calm truth. The kind of statement that didn't need repeating. That he gave a short nod. "If they come here, they'll have to deal with me." Tala looked at him for a long time, then said, just above a whisper, "That's the first time someone's ever said that to me." Jonas didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't try. He just stoked the fire and sat nearby while she served the stew. Later that night, while she sat cross-legged on the rug near the hearth, Jonas pulled down a small wooden box from the shelf above his cot. She watched as he opened it and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. "What's that?" she asked. My land deed, he said. The original. Signed in town. Before the war. She shifted, interested. He held it up, looked at the faded ink. Never mattered much before. But maybe it does now. She tilted her head. Why now? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned the paper around and pointed to the signature. Eliza Reddick, he said. That was my wife. Tala didn't say anything, just nodded slowly. She understood the meaning without needing every word. The paper was a record, a beginning and an end. You never thought of leaving? She asked. Plenty of times, he said. But the cabin stayed. So I did too. Tala ran her thumb along the edge of the blanket in her lap. I think I stayed too long in places I should have left, and ran from places I maybe should have stayed. Jonas looked at her. This one of those. She looked around the cabin. At the fire. The shelf she'd cleaned earlier that day. The battered tin cup she always used now. Then back to him. No, she said quietly. Not this one. He didn't speak. Just folded the deed carefully and placed it back in the box. That night, she didn't draw the blanket across the room. She let it hang open. And when she lay down in her cot near the fire, she didn't face the wall. She faced him. And he didn't look away. By morning, she was already boiling coffee when he rose. Her hair was still loose, thicker now with health. He noticed she'd washed one of the old dresses in the wash basin. It hung by the stove, drying in the warmth. She'd patched it herself. You sleep? He asked. Enough. They drank their coffee quietly. Then Jonas stood and grabbed his coat. I'm going to check the traps, he said. Might be a few rabbits left. Do you want me to come? She asked. He looked at her, surprised. You sure? She nodded. I won't slow you down. He hesitated, then reached for the second coat on the hook. The one she'd worn when she first arrived, mended now, and warmer as he tossed it to her. She caught it, pulled it over her shoulders, and followed him out into the morning light. The snow was nearly gone now, but something else had taken root. The trail behind the cabin wound through bare cottonwoods and frozen brush. The old trap line marking a route Jonas had walked 100 times before, alone. But this time he wasn't alone. Tala followed 3 paces behind, wrapped in the patched coat, boots crunching soft through thawing snow. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Jonas could hear her breathing, even and steady, the way a person breathes when they know how to move through silence. The traps were mostly empty. Too late in the season. But that wasn't why he brought her out. He wanted her to see the ridge, the boundary of his land. And he wanted to see how she walked now, not just with her body but with her eyes. She wasn't scanning for threats. Not the same way she had a few weeks ago. She still looked sure, still listened. But the fear wasn't driving her now. It was habit and strength. The final trap near the creek. Jonas crouched low and reset the rusted spring. Tala stepped beside him, watching. You ever trap before? He asked. She gave a short nod. Some. My brother taught me. Jonas didn't look up. Where's he now? She was quiet a moment. Gone. Years ago. That was all she said. And it was enough. They sat for a few minutes by the creek, passing a strip of dried meat back and forth, sharing a canteen. The sun had climbed higher, warm enough now that you could sit without shivering. Birds were returning. Jonas heard the call of a mourning dove and thought of how long it had been since he noticed something like that. You trust me now? He asked plainly. Tala didn't answer right away. Then she shrugged slightly. I haven't run. He nodded. You've had chances. They were both quiet again. She turned to him then, her voice low but even. Do you want me to stay? Jonas looked at her. It wasn't a light question. It wasn't something a man like him answered without weight. I didn't bring you here to keep you, he said. I know. He paused. But I haven't asked you to leave either. Her eyes searched his. That's not an answer. He set the canteen down, adjusted his coat. You want plain truth? Yes. He nodded slowly. I don't know what this is yet, but the cabin feels less empty when you're in it. Tala didn't smile. She didn't blush or look away. She just sat with it, let the words settle like dust on old wood. That evening, back at the cabin, they sat closer than usual. Not touching, but near enough that the heat from the fire reached both of them, and their shadows crossed on the floorboards. She'd cooked a simple stew with rabbit from one of the traps and the last of the carrots she'd found in the bin under the back shelf. Jonas ate quietly, then leaned back in his chair, hands resting on his stomach. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. He turned his head. "This place. Everything." He exhaled through his nose. "I used to. Every damn day after they passed. But when there's nothing to go to, the urge fades." Tala nodded. "I don't want to keep running." He studied her face. The way the firelight softened the sharpness of her jaw. The way her hands had stopped fidgeting. She was steady. "Still, you don't have to," he said. A beat passed. She stood, slowly, and walked to the cot where things were folded now, neatly, with care. She pulled out a small pouch. Inside it, she took out a polished stone, dark green with flecks of red. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "It's the only thing I kept." Jonas stood, walked over. Tala held it out, then set on the shelf above the stove. She didn't say why. But Jonas understood. That night, she didn't go to her cot. She sat near his by the fire, and when he stood to bank the coals, she stood too. Closed out, he reached up, touched her braid. Her breathing hitched, but she didn't pull back. "You sure?" he asked. She looked up at him. "Yes." It wasn't lust. It wasn't rescued. It was choice. And when they lay down together that night, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't showy. It was quiet, earned. Hands on skin, not to claim, but to stay in. Oh, promises were spoken. No declarations made. But by morning, when she woke up tucked against his chest and his arms still resting over her waist, something had changed. Not in fear, not in duty, but in belonging. She rose and made the coffee. He whittled a small peg for the back door latch. Routine came again, but it was different now. Shared. That evening, while sweeping near the hearth, Tala turned and asked, "What was your son's name?" Jonas paused. "Micah." She nodded. "He would have been proud of you." He didn't answer, just looked at her, quiet, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the old burn of grief, just the warmth of something returning, something staying. The days after that night passed with a new weight between them, not heavy with suspicion, but with a quiet tension neither of them had words for. Jonas noticed the change in small ways. How Tala no longer flinched when their shoulders brushed near the stove. How she met his gaze now instead of looking past him. How she took it upon herself to tend the wash basin, sweep the cabin floor with a pine broom, and fold the quilts without being asked. She didn't smile. He didn't either. But the silence they shared now felt like agreement, not avoidance. She was healing slowly. The bruises faded from her face. Her voice grew steadier when she spoke, and her steps, though cautious, no longer dragged. By the fourth morning, she had asked for a knife to help chop vegetables. Jonas gave her one without hesitation. "I ain't seen anyone walk out of that kind of storm," he said, watching her slice potatoes into the stew pot. "I didn't walk out," she said, not looking up. "You carried me." He nodded once, accepting that. There was still one question hanging in the air, something she hadn't explained and something he hadn't asked. Why had no one come looking for her? Jonas suspected there had been more than one man involved in whatever drove her south. He knew the marks of abuse when he saw them. She carried old scars, faint burns near her ribs, a knife wound low across her hip, and a deep bruise that had taken weeks to fade under her jaw. These weren't the results of a single ambush. This was sustained cruelty, but she never spoke of those men. She never named them. He let her keep that point one night. As rain tapped lightly on the roof, she asked, "Why didn't you go back east after the war?" He sat with his boots off, sharpening a small chisel by lantern light. "No reason to," he said. "Family gone. Land was here. Easier to stay still." She sat at the table beside him, mending one of her blouses. "But it's hard land. Hard life." He shrugged. "I'm a hard man. You're not." He looked up at her. "Ain't soft either." Tala gave the slightest tilt of her head, a smirk that wasn't quite a smile. "You're honest. That's rarer than kindness." Jonas thought about that the rest of the evening. The next morning, they both heard the sound, a rider. Hoofbeats breaking fast over the ridge, close, urgent. Jonas was out the door before she could react. He reached for the rifle hanging by the doorway, checked the chamber, and stood firm on the porch, eyes scanning the bend where the trail met the tree line. Tala stood behind him, silent. The rider came into view. Just one, a younger man, maybe 25, face half covered with dust and a red scarf, riding hard on a paint gelding. He didn't draw a weapon, just slowed up when he saw the rifle. "Jonas Reddick?" the man called out. Jonas didn't lower the gun. "That's me. I came from Bisbee. Name's Carter Blake. I'm a new post writer. There's a letter for you." Jonas narrowed his eyes. "Didn't expect mail." "Me neither," the man muttered, dismounting. "It's marked from Flagstaff. Courthouse seal." Jonas lowered the rifle, stepped forward, and took the envelope. Carter Blake mounted back up. "Didn't mean to startle you. Just doing my rounds. You always come through this way?" Jonas asked. "No, just once a month now. Trying a new route. Sheriff said you used to be registered down there. Figured you ought to get what's yours." And with that, he tipped his hat and rode off down the slope. Tala watched him go, her hand still resting at her side, close to the knife tucked into her waistband. Inside, Jonas opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the paper, brief, formal, legal language. He set it down on the table. "What is it?" Tala asked. "Notice of forfeiture," he said simply. "Land ownership expires if I don't file a renewal in person." "When?" "By spring. Can we make it?" He looked at her. "We." She didn't correct herself, that he rubbed his jaw. "We'd have to leave before April. Ride through Clifton. Maybe stop in Silver Falls." Tala nodded. "Then we do that." Jonas studied her. "It's a long ride. Cold nights. Dangerous roads. I've had worse." He didn't argue. That night, they lay in the same bed again. She curled into him. His arm around her wasn't hesitant anymore. It was habit now. "Do you want me to take your name?" she asked in the dark. Jonas blinked. "You don't have to. I know. But do you want me to?" He didn't answer right away till he reached across her shoulder and pulled her closer. "I'd give it to you if you asked," he said. Tala exhaled, slow. "Then I'm asking." He kissed her temple. "Then it's yours. No ceremony. No preacher. Just truth shared between two people who had walked through hell and found something worth staying for." Outside, the rain kept falling, soft on the roof. Inside, for the first time in years, Jonas Reddick didn't feel alone. The next 2 weeks passed in preparation. Jonas had never traveled more than a few miles from the ridge since burying his wife and son. He hadn't planned on ever leaving again. But now he found himself moving with purpose, oiling the saddle, checking the mule's shoes, counting supplies in the small pantry. The trip to Flagstaff wouldn't be short, and with spring runoff turning creeks into rivers, they'd need to ride hard before the roads washed out. Tala took over the indoor work. She boiled the last of the dried beans, wrapped biscuits in cloth, and packed jerky into small oilskin bundles. She stitched torn seams on both their coats and lined the saddlebags with fresh wool. She didn't talk much during those days, but her hands didn't stop moving. They both knew what the trip meant. Not just a land deed, but something final. Something public. "You sure you want your name on a record like that?" Jonas asked one night as they sat near the fire, going over the route again. "Papers filed in town mean folks will know." "I want them to," she said. Jonas stared into the fire, jaw clenched. "And if someone recognizes you?" "Then they'll know I'm not alone anymore." He nodded once and didn't bring it up again. They left at first light. The cabin sat quiet behind them, smoke curling up from the chimney one last time before they disappeared into the trees. Tala rode behind Jonas on the mule, wrapped in his old coat, rifle strapped to the saddle. She didn't complain once on the trail. Even as the cold bit hard along the ridge line and icy winds howled through the pines at night, they camped near the fire, bedrolls pulled close. Jonas kept watch with his back to hers. On the fourth night, she turned in her sleep and curled toward him. He didn't move, just tucked the blanket higher around her shoulders and stayed awake until the wind died down. They reached Silver Falls without trouble. The town was smaller than Jonas remembered, just 2 streets and a church now, half the buildings boarded up from winter storms. Folks stared when they passed through. A white man with a rifle and a Kiowa-looking woman in his coat. But no one said anything. Jonas didn't linger. He traded for coffee, bullets, and 2 pounds of salt. Tala picked up cloth and needles from the general store. The woman behind the counter didn't speak to her, just watched her hands. When they got back outside, Jonas caught the edge in Tala's expression. "She looked at me like I was dirt," she said. "She looked at you like she didn't understand." "She didn't try to." No, but she didn't stop us either. Tala gave a short nod. I don't care what they think. I just don't want it passed down. Jonas tilted his head. Passed down. Tala looked at him, direct, measured. If we have a child someday. He froze, not because he hadn't thought about it, but because he hadn't let himself believe she might want that. I wouldn't let anything touch them, he said. I know. That night, they slept closer than ever. No words, just warmth and the sound of her steady breathing beside him. By the time they reached Flagstaff, the ground had softened. Spring had arrived early down in the basin. Mud clung to the mule's legs and rivers of meltwater carved paths through the edge of the woods. The courthouse was simple, wooden front, dusty windows, the American flag faded above the doorway. Jonas tied the mule outside and helped Tala down. She adjusted the collar of her coat and stepped beside him. Inside, it was warmer, smelled of paper and old ink. The clerk was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a clean shirt tucked too tightly into his belt. He looked up when Jonas handed him the deed. Name? Jonas Reddick. Renewal? Yes. And an update. The man blinked. Update. Jonas stepped slightly aside so Tala was in full view. She's my wife. The clerk looked from Jonas to Tala. You got a certificate? No, but you can record it. Her name is Tala Reddick. The man hesitated. Then, without comment, dipped his pen and began to write. Afterward, they stepped out into the sunlight. Tala squinted against it, shoulders tense. You okay? Jonas asked. She nodded. It's done. They stayed one more night in town, in a boarding house on the edge of the square. 2 beds pushed together. A clean fire. Real sheets. That night, as she rested against him, Tala whispered. You know I was late before we left? Jonas looked at her, his hand still resting across her stomach. You sure? I'm not sick. I'm not bleeding. I feel different. Same way my sister did. He said nothing for a long moment, then leaned in and kissed her forehead. We'll make space, he said simply. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. They returned to the ridge just as the first wildflowers began pushing up through the thaw-softened ground. The air had changed. It wasn't just the season. It was the quiet way the cabin no longer felt like a shelter from grief, but like a place meant for something new. Jonas noticed it the moment he stepped down from the mule and saw the smoke curling from the chimney as if the place had been waiting for them. Tala moved slower now. Not from pain. There was none, but from caution, the same kind of care Jonas had seen in pregnant Mara's back on his father-in-law's ranch years ago. She hadn't needed a doctor to confirm it. Her body told her everything she needed to know. She was with child, and Jonas, though not a man prone to smiles, found himself looking at her differently now. More aware, more protective, but also more certain. He had no doubts anymore. Not about her, not about himself, not about the road they'd chosen. The days resumed their rhythm, but everything felt steadier. He rebuilt the roof on the shed with new pine boards while she boiled linens and stitched small cloth for the baby. She dug a little plot near the slope for vegetables, and he lined it with stones to keep the runoff from washing the seeds away. They replaced the old cradle box his wife had once carved from cedar. Tala painted it with symbols from her people, smooth and bold, just above where Jonas had carved the child's name. Micah for his son, and Lonnie for the one to come point one morning. They sat on the porch while Tala sorted dried herbs and placed them in small jars. Jonas sipped his coffee and watched the ridge trail. He hadn't seen another rider since Carter Blake brought the letter, and if anyone had come looking for her, they were too late now. The courthouse papers were filed. The name was legal. The land was in both of theirs, and no man with a badge or a Bible could undo it. Do you ever miss them? She asked suddenly. He didn't have to ask who. Every day, he said, but not the way I used to. She nodded. I think about mine too. My brother, my sisters, all the places we passed through. You think you'll ever want to go back to where they buried them? She thought about that a long time before answering. No, she said. Not if I'm just going to visit graves. But if someday we can build something here that makes their stories matter, then I won't need to. Jonas leaned forward and reached for her hand. She let him take it. He rubbed his thumb across the inside of her palm. Rough, callous from work, but warm. That afternoon, they walked the property line together. not as a patrol, like it had once been, but as a quiet ritual, two people walking the length of their own hard-earned peace. When they reached the fence near the canyon's edge, Tala paused. This was the spot where he'd first found her, half buried, clutching that knife. She stepped to the edge and looked out. The wind pushed her braid against her back. "I was ready to die here," she said. Jonas stepped behind her. "And I was just trying to patch a fence." She glanced over her shoulder. "Funny how both of us were at the edge." "Not anymore." She turned and wrapped her arms around his waist. He held her carefully, his hands now mindful of a new life growing between them. The baby came in the early fall. It was a quiet birth. Just the two of them. She didn't scream. She breathed slow and deep, and he did what needed doing: boiled water, cut cloth, steadied her through the worst of it. And when it was over, and the infant cried out, raw and alive, Tala laughed through tears. "It's a girl," she whispered. Jonas held the tiny bundle with both hands, like it was something sacred. Tala named her Lonnie Micah Reddick, a name stitched from two lives, one lost, one saved, both reborn. They raised her without fuss, without ceremony, but with firewood always stacked, beans always soaking, and hands always held when the sun went down. Years later, when travelers came through the Ridge Trail and asked about the quiet man and the Apache woman who lived up in the hills, the story they heard wasn't one of war or tragedy. It was of a man who once thought he was done living and a woman who was nearly dead, but neither let go. And together, they built something that lasted.